Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our presentation, the submission number 64, titled Harnessing Robot Experimentation to Optimize the Regulatory Framing of Emerging Robot Technologies at this 2021 Data for Policy Conference. I'm Eduard Fosch Villaronga, and I currently work at the ELO Center for Law and Digital Technologies at Leiden University. And my work revolves around understanding the legal and regulatory implications of the use of robots for society. And for today's session, I am joined by my colleagues, Carlos Calleja and Hadassah Drukarch.
Hello, I'm Carlos Calleja, and I'm affiliated with the PROPELLING project. I've been working with robotics and AI, and I'm mainly focused on safety validation and the standardization of testing methods for emerging technologies.
And hi, my name is Hadassah Drukarch. I am a researcher at the ELO Center for Law and Digital Technologies at Leiden University, and my work intersects the fields of law, digital technologies, healthcare, business, and governance. I'm also the founder of The Law of Tech, an online platform which aims to prepare the legal world of tomorrow by educating on the implications of new technologies for the law and legal industry.
On the program for our session today, we will introduce our work under the PROPELLING project, and we will discuss some of the early hurdles and lessons that we have spotted. We kick off with some of the difficulties in regulating emerging robots, particularly the paucity of evidence-based policymaking and information asymmetries. Then we canvas PROPELLING, the project with which we aim at tackling those difficulties. We also introduce the project's models and its goals. The third part of this presentation focuses on ISO 13482-2014, the first standard for non-medical robots used for personal care, and some of the shortcomings that we identified in the early stages of our project. Finally, we present some of the perplexities and early lessons that we have learned as our project starts unfolding. That part will lead up to a discussion that hopefully you will be joining at the end of our presentation.
Now, new technologies offer possibilities until recently unimaginable and can solve problems faster, better, and more efficiently than ever before. For instance, consider exoskeleton technologies which allow physically impaired individuals to walk again and climb stairs. Now, although technology and regulation evolve, there is a paucity in harnessing R&D outcomes to improve existing regulatory instruments. Indeed, while the chemical, food, and pharmaceutical industries years ago already established use evidence-based models that ensure the safety of these products EU-wide, these frameworks have yet to be seen within robotics regulation. Albeit there is no model easily transposable to the realm of robotics, the contrast serves to highlight how the regulatory landscape for these devices is currently populated by a myriad of technology-neutral regulations, abstract codes of conduct, and trustworthy-based ethical guidelines. These rules, however, lack the necessary empirical grounding to inform researchers, designers, and developers' practices adequately. Not rarely, developers find themselves with unclear regulatory guidance. In this scenario, they are often left to decide if, and if so, how the development process can be continued. They could choose either a positive fit, or valorize, B, an unclear legal fit, as ask clarification, permission, or assume negative, and C, negative or no fit, a stop, adapt, or lobby or ignore. Now, the lack of adequate information is among the reasons behind the scarcity of adequate interventions. How much regulators know about technology, its effects, or the regulatory environment is critical for regulating emerging developments. Crafting policies on the verge of further development demands, on the one hand, dealing with scant to non-existent data on hazards, and on the other, predicting how technology will evolve, including its impacts. When it comes down to robots, the problem goes beyond insufficient information, as even the test methods have not been put into action or broadly evaluated. Emerging robotics, and particularly lower limb exoskeletons, are prone to that kind of phenomena. These body-borne devices are inextricably intertwined with the human body, and as such, they raise particular questions in different dimensions that range from safety to data protection, dignity, agency, control, and trust. However, the content of those impacts remains largely under-theorized. Think of the impact of data security on user safety. Exoskeletons and cyber-physical systems directly fastened to the user's body that can have vulnerabilities in security, which can ulteriorly compromise the correct functioning of the device. While a myriad of safety hazards can arise from cybersecurity vulnerabilities to cyber-physical systems, the extent of that impact is still to be entirely determined. Beyond specific impacts, the methods for assessing risks also remain a contested matter. He and colleagues documented a lack of uniformity on inclusion and exclusion criteria for testing subjects, along with reports of adverse events and identified risks. This lack of evaluation methods and reporting systems opens up a gulf between safe devices and those whose hazards remain unknown due to poor framing and testing.
Imagine a responsive policymaker who wishes to regulate robots based on empirical data. She would undoubtedly be puzzled by the sort of information required, whether the sources are generalizable or whether data from isolated experiments could provide the basis for governing real-life risks. With those issues in mind, the European Union's Horizon 2020 is funding the Eurobench project, a program that aims at setting the first framework for the development of benchmarks for robotic systems. And its purpose is to develop methods and tools to assess devices in a rigorous but also replicable way. PROPELLING, which is within this project, gathers a multidisciplinary team to execute Eurobench protocols. The goal is to improve not only a specific device, but also the overall regulation for regulating robotics. In this sense, PROPELLING will use the Eurobench test facilities, including software and databases, to assess a combination of indicators and control algorithms, reflecting on the possibility to harness experimentation as a source of evidence-based knowledge for policy interventions is thus PROPELLING's objective. So what is PROPELLING's main focus? The project is primarily focused on lower limb exoskeletons, specifically on Techno-8's EXO H3. And in light of ISO 13482-2014 for personal care robots, it is the first safety standard devoted to this type of service robotics. It does test particular safety requirements for systematically appraising safety assessments and regulations for marketed lower limb robotic exoskeletons. Instead of focusing on the device, however, what we seek it is to understand if this ISO standard addresses safety sufficiently and comprehensively. And in addition, some of the safety requirements revolve around topics identified in the context of the H2020 Cost Action 16.11.6 on wearable robots, such as these concerning psychological aspects, for instance, the fear of falling, push recovery algorithms, and different user categories. There are indeed some indications that this particular standard on personal care robots fails to address safety comprehensively and accurately. For instance, while balance loss is the second cause of falls among older adults, travel instability measures do not apply to lower limb exoskeletons. Another example is that while obstacles can cause a risk to normal gait, for instance, let's think about the stairs or objects, this standard on personal care robots, however, states that collisions with safety-related objects, other robots, and fragile safety-related objects, walls, permanent and movable barriers, are not applicable to restraint-type physical assistant robots that are, in this case, lower limb exoskeletons.
As my colleague Eduard just pointed out, there are reasons to think that ISO 13482-2014 fails to appropriately identify hazards and safety measures, a rather unsurprising feature if one considers the procedures to reach an agreement and the fact that it was developed as technology is still under development. Now, before discussing some of the lessons we have learned in the early stages of PROPELLING, it is important to zoom into some of the issues arguably poisoning what is considered the first standards for care robots. Let us start with validation. Safety requirements aside, a recent technical report recognizes that most of the testing methods for robotics exoskeletons have not been implemented or evaluated in terms of their accuracy and reproducibility, thus hindering developers' applications of safety standards. In the sense that a technical report that the same technical report suggested that users of the document should use it with care and being wary that the methods hasn't been tested. Now going to some of the specific hazards, it is worth noting that fear of falling or vasophobia is among the leading causes behind reduced mobility, independence, and quality of life among elderly populations. For exoskeleton technology, the fear of falling can compromise and constrain the device's performance that aims to restore a regular gait pattern and not a feared one. Although such a psychological aspect is so tightly connected with safety, the standard does not include fear of falling as a potential hazard associated with lower limb exoskeletons. Propelling thus proposes a method to test whether fear of falling is a hazard associated with lower limb exoskeletons. It seeks to monitor different users' heart and respiration rates while using the device in different conditions. These include sitting, standing, and walking conditions while wearing the exoskeleton. It also includes fear-related scenarios. The second set of testing protocols entails a perturbing user while wearing the device and measuring its recovery from those perturbations. Both settings are complemented with questionnaires aimed at measuring their mental stress and heart acceleration. These tests generate data that can be measured against specific performance indicators. For example, the fall efficacy scale that are expected to work as a predictors not only of fear of falling, but also of a risk of actually falling. Similarly, the ISO standard invites manufacturers to define personal care robots halting, but does not include specific guidelines on the scenarios where protective stops should be initiated, whether there could be automatic protective stop, nor measures to address faulty or hampered stops. For instance, the standard leaves the question of reachability open. In this sense, the ISO standards does not clarify whether a button should be quickly accessible to the user, nor it sets limits to whether other persons could activate it. Think, for instance, on the device developed within the HABSO project, where the button is situated in the rear side of the exoskeleton. Or consider those circumstances contemplated within the ISO standard, where the protective stop may be automatically initiated. These circumstances could not only hamper reachability by the user, they may also expose her to vandalism or cyber attacks. Propelling thus suggests executing two scenarios. One, replicating on unstructured environments, and the other characterizing impacts on muscle coordination. Here, the used benchmarks aim at providing information on the interaction between users of different ages and genders and the exoskeleton itself. Those indicators inform the implementation of design measures and provide data on the standardization of testing methods. They also provide information that could be correlated with other indicators to discover the impact of cyber attacks and faulty features on user safety. This may suggest the need to standardize novel safeguarding alternatives and testing criteria for cyber physical systems and protective stops, potentially impacting standards for personal care robots. Last but not least, the ISO standards fails to include instability in collision among hazards related to lower limb exoskeletons. Indicators about safety subjects' ability to maintain balance may suggest improving the standard to address such a hazard specifically. Furthermore, information about stability in unstructured environments could indicate validating measures to address the risk of falling. Propelling aims at using stability as an indicator for the capability of different subjects to maintain balance while wearing an exoskeleton. Furthermore, data on different ages and genders suggests specific standards for distinct categories of subjects. Now, it is worth identifying two overarching problems from the outset. First, in light of the lack of standardized methods, there is a risk that the evidence gathered will fail to frame the technology appropriately. Without the tools for unearthing safety hazards in a manner that could be replicable, we run the risk of ending up with offshot experiments that lack the necessary reproducibility for informing general regulations. Second, propelling aims at unearthing information on whether gaps in test facilities, particularly concerning the determination of risk of collision instability, fail to provide adequate data to inform regulators. This information is essential to understand what gaps the testing facility has in providing a good variety of scenarios to test different safety requirements, for instance, on slippery terrains. Now turning to early lessons. Certainly, evidence tells what works and what are the risks, especially within the context of the development of new technologies. Still, one can continue by asking what kind of evidence will deliver the necessary results, how reliable the information should be, or which sources deserve attention. An evidence-based approach is as good as the type of evidence gathered. The quality of that evidence depends on the quality and reproducibility of the methods used and its collection. Still, the field of robotics largely lacks such methodologies. The problem with lower-limb exoskeletons and robotics in general is the paucity of agreed methods for evaluating certain parts of such developments, mainly psychological, but also other aspects such as trust, dignity, and privacy. For instance, the ISO standards acknowledge in a technical report, as we just mentioned, that the test methods for exoskeletons are not put into action or broadly evaluated regarding their accuracy or reproducibility. Also, the standard stated that the working group will revise the definition of personal care robots, taking into account concrete users such as children, elderly persons, and pregnant women. However, the revised standard in 2020 did not show any change in this respect. The second missing step is the lack of a connection between lack of indicators for determining the existence of a hazard and the subsequent need for addressing the issue. Identifying what aspects constitute a safety hazard and which aspects should be evaluated and safeguarded are extremely difficult to reach without field knowledge. On top of that, there is nothing like the medical ideal of serving a patient's interest in technology regulation. In robotics, for example, the ISO standard does not define personal care. It has many confusing categories that seem to suggest avoiding compliance with the medical device regulations rather than ensuring user safety. However, regulation not only serves the goals of safety, and if they do, safety has many dimensions, not only physical. As these devices become more interconnected, ubiquitous, and incorporate artificial intelligence, other aspects concerning privacy, discrimination, and even cybersecurity should be taken into account. The findings published by the Liaison Project highlight this issue and stress that although each of the standards investigated within the context of the project, including the ISO standard, is concerned with physical safety requirements, the legislative system includes many other fundamental rights to be protected. In this line of thought, insights from the broader community of stakeholders within the context of this project have indicated that standards should shift from mono-impact to multi-impact. In this sense, they should include factors related to ethics, environment and sustainability, liability, accountability, privacy, data protection, and psychological aspects, further stressing the needs for a multidisciplinary and multi-stakeholder approach in crafting policies aimed at framing new technologies. Last but not least, a proposal for harnessing experimentation should also be mindful of regulatory bottlenecks. Experimentation methods should not only be appropriate for unearthing needs and deficiencies, for institutions and instruments to keep an adequate connection with the stream of technological innovation. These methods should also sweep the procedures and practices behind regulatory development, which can generally be divided into public and private policymaking initiatives.
In light of these difficulties, we identified two lessons at the early stages of propelling. First of all, testbeds represent an experimental, co-creative approach to innovation policy that aims to test, demonstrate, and advance new socio-technical arrangements under real-world conditions. In the simplest sense, thus, testbeds are controlled experimental spaces that facilitate a kind of performance or hypothesis testing under presumably realistic conditions. Hence, they bring in a promising environment for developing generalizable benchmarks and testing methods for robotics and emerging technologies. The second lesson is the convenience of creating shared data repositories and connecting them to policymaking. The aim is to gather data concerning compliance with the law of a particular project, robot use or development, and use it is as evidence for policymaking. These shared data repositories could take the form of databases compiling the results of reproducible experiments and risk assessments, along with related robot legislation or regulation collected over time and across many projects. Documenting and formalizing these processes in lessons learned would allow the regulatory framework to have a grounded knowledge and understanding of what characteristics and regulatory needs new robot technologies have, and this knowledge could be highly valuable for future developers and policymakers. In this vein, developing replicable experiments and agreed yardsticks and complementing them with data repositories accessible to regulators is the path forward to evidence-based standard making. Linking experimentation settings with standard making processes can speed the creation, revision, or discontinuation of norms governing robot technology, increase their effectiveness in ensuring overall safety, and the legal certainty regarding the fast-paced changing environment like robotics. Overall, what lacks in robot governance is a backstep mechanism that can coordinate and align robot and regulatory developers. In this vein, gathering information is vital for framing technology adequately. Moreover, experimentation serves as an appealing source of data on emerging developments for this purpose. However, harnessing that information largely depends on whether that evidence comes from replicable and generalizable methods that fit the regulatory process. Research on those aspects in the field of regulatory interventions for robotics and modern technologies currently remains, though, in its infancy. Here, as a conclusion, we introduce propelling as a stepping stone in ideating practical ways to use benchmarking ecosystems such as the Eurobench facilities as data generators for policymaking. This process can make robot oversight more precise and concrete, allowing for easier compliance and virtually not wasting the potential that testing zones have to generate relevant knowledge for policymaking. Now, we hope to hear your thoughts and questions regarding our project. Changing paradigms take a village, and we are convinced that academic debate sets the path to further refining our tool and methods. So thank you so much for your attention, and do not hesitate to contact us for more information.